going to read just 3 verses from Isaiah chapter 40. I'm going to read from verse 9 to verse 11. Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good news. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good news. Lift it up, fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will gather them. He will carry them in his bosom, and gently lead those that are with young. When I was growing up in the 80s, bodybuilding was a really big craze. Male bodybuilders would become the biggest stars in the world, and the tough guys in the movies stopped being played by men who conveyed toughness through their steely, hard stares like Charles Bronson or Clint Eastwood, and became men whose toughness was measured by the size of their biceps. It was, I must add, a craze that didn't really touch me. Bodybuilding seemed much too much like hard work for me. But for many of my classmates, it was something which they dabbled in and really got heavily involved in as well. Joining gyms, buying the magazines, buying the protein supplements. And it seemed that masculinity was being redefined and defined as something that was all about physical strength. Now, there are, of course, many other forms of strength. You can have intellectual strength, emotional strength, relational strength, and I suppose economic strength. Strength comes in all shapes and sizes. But strength, whatever kind of strength we're talking about, cannot be an end in itself. To have achieved strength is not enough. The real question is not how strong are you, but what do you use your strength for? I remember one boy in school who, having spent months building up his body, then decided to use his strength to bully the smaller boys in his class. On a much, much larger scale, we are at this moment seeing the might of the Russian military machine being used in an unprovoked attempt to crush its neighbour Ukraine. Whatever strength we have is mere weakness unless it is accompanied by the moral strength to do what is right. Now, these verses that we just read, they are part of a passage that is all about the strength of God. The God of Israel is presented as a great and powerful king, the greatest and the most powerful king. Before the vastness of his majesty, no one can reasonably claim to have any majesty of their own. And compared to his authority, all other authority is illusionary. And so verse 15 of Isaiah 40 says, behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are accounted as the dust on the scales. Behold, he takes up the coastlands like fine dust. But the point that's being made isn't so much that the kings of the world are puny compared to the Lord. It is more that all the gods worshipped by the other kings of the world and the nations that they rule over, the nations as well that threatened Israel, these gods are puny by comparison to the God of Israel. And so towards the end of the chapter we read, to whom then will you compare me, that I should be like him, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these, referring, of course, to the stars that we see at night. He who brings out their host by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might. Here is the God who has created the stars themselves. Who can possibly compare with him? That's really what's being said here. And so the Lord is incomparably powerful. The Lord is infinite in strength and in authority. I guess this goes some way to explaining what the Bible means when it calls God the Holy One, as it does in the verse that we just read. But that isn't enough. We can no longer be impressed by that. Strength, as we've already noted, is not an end in itself. And of itself, it's nothing really to be praised. We might say God is infinitely strong, but someone else might quite rightly and reasonably shrug their shoulders and say, well, so what? Because, as we've seen, it isn't enough to be strong. We need to ask, what does God use his strength for? And the answer to that question comes in verse 11, which we read earlier. He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. God uses his overwhelming, his infinite strength to nurture and to care for his people. The image of a shepherd is apt, since a shepherd needs to have a great deal of strength, not just physical strength, to do his or her job, and ultimately their job is one of care and nurture. And so the one who possesses power over the universe deploys that unthinkable power with one purpose in mind: the well-being of his people. And the life of Jesus is proof enough of this. His conception is among the most powerful of all of God's works, of all the works witnessed by this universe. God became a human being. The infinite God became a baby. And yet why? Why this act of nature-bending power? As Jesus himself tells us in John chapter 10 and verse 10, I came that they, referring to his people whom he calls his sheep, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. The conception, it happened so that we might have abundant life. And Jesus' entire life, a life of breathtaking power and authority in which he calmed storms, healed the sick and raised the dead, was in the ultimate act of strength, willingly surrendered. Why? As the Saviour says in the very next verse, John 10 verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He could have used his power for other things. That's what he was tempted to do in the wilderness. We are told that he was tempted to use his power and his strength to satisfy his own hunger, to prove that God was with him, and to gain all the power of the nations of the world. And yet he wouldn't. He didn't. His power was to be used for the benefit of others and for nothing else. His strength was to be spilled out as a sacrificial offering to his Father on behalf of his people. And so here is your God, in all his astonishing glory and majesty, a man, a shepherd, a king, living for you, exercising power and authority for you, crucified for you. This is strength. And this is strength to wonder at. This is a strength to inspire worship. But this is also a strength that challenges us. We are all strong in many different ways. Those of us who are relatively fit and healthy have physical strength. Most of us also have the strength to carry and to bear the emotions of others, our families and our friends. We have the intellectual strength to solve problems, and many of us have the economic strength strength given by a disposable income. And so the challenge that the life of Jesus presents us with is this. Considering all the strength that we have and the different forms of strength that we have, what are we going to use it for?